Welcome to The Unusual History of Everything, the podcast that uncovers the unusual history of everything around us. I'm Karen Lacey.
And I'm Melanie Dellis. On this episode, we look at the history of and the science behind radiocarbon dating artifacts and what changes will be necessary in the future.
In 1949, a chemist from Colorado named Willard Libby figured out a way to date organic materials by looking at the levels of carbon-14, also known as radiocarbon. We call it carbon dating or radiocarbon dating, and it has revolutionized the field of archaeology. Prior to this, archaeologists used relative techniques that provided a rough chronology and absolute methods that provided a more accurate way of determining the age of the artifact.
Relative techniques include stratigraphy and seriation. Stratigraphy is where you analyze the order and position of layers of archaeological remains to determine age. Archaeologists use the law of superposition, which is the assumption that the lower layers are older than the upper layers, to create a chronology for the site. This is followed by using contextual clues about the area surrounding the site and absolute dating techniques to get an age. Seriation is where you group artifacts from the same site together according to style or frequency of use and put them in chronological order to determine the age.
Although relative techniques are useful, they're not accurate and are very subjective. It often happens that the location where an artifact is found relative to other objects may not reflect its true age, because that object could have been moved over time. That's why absolute methods for age determination are better. These methods include thermoluminescent dating, dendrochronology, and radiocarbon dating. Thermoluminescence dating measures years that have gone by since the heating of materials that contain crystalline materials. It's great for lava, ceramics, and sediments that were exposed to a large amount of UV light. Dendrochronology is a study of tree rings, which is perfect for dating wooden structures or artifacts.
But what we really want to focus on today is radiocarbon dating, which relies on chemistry to determine the age of organic matter by measuring the amount of radioactive carbon decay, or carbon-14, and comparing it to an internationally used reference standard. Carbon-14 is an unstable and weakly radioactive isotope of carbon that is continuously formed in our upper atmosphere by the effect of cosmic ray neutrons on nitrogen-14 atoms and then oxidized in the air to form carbon dioxide. That is so sciencey. I'm like lost.
I actually totally know what all of that means.
Oh my goodness.
Because of my archaeological studies.
Yes, so I get it, but when I was saying it, I was like, nobody's going to know what I'm talking about right now. It just sounds so...
Sciencey?
Sciencey. Okay, anyway, plants, animals, and humans assimilate carbon-14 from carbon dioxide during their lives, and when they die, their carbon-14 content starts to decrease at a rate determined by the law of radioactive decay. Radiocarbon dating is basically a method that measures the carbon-14 that's left and compares it to the carbon-14 levels in the atmosphere at that moment to determine when the organism died.
The discovery of radiocarbon dating has been truly amazing, as it has led researchers to accurately determine the age of many artifacts, including mummies and organic materials such as the oldest copy of the Quran. The rare book room in the University of Birmingham in the UK housed leaves from an ancient Quran manuscript since 1920, and they were left there until a researcher named Albra Fadeli noticed the leaves were out of place with the other pages that they were stored with. And these pages were written in ink and a type of script called Hijazi onto pieces of goat skin. They were taken to an Oxford lab for radiocarbon dating, and it was determined that the animal the skin belonged to died between 568 and 645 AD, making these fragments among the oldest copies in the world.
That's so cool. Well, as awesome as they are, absolute techniques have their drawbacks as well. For example, in the case of radiocarbon dating, the object has to be younger than 62,000 years old. You don't get an exact age, only a range, and that range can be thrown off if the object has come into contact with organic material that's younger. In the 1970s, a more efficient radiocarbon dating method was discovered called accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS. AMS measures the unstable isotope carbon-14 relative to the amount of stable isotopes carbon-12 and carbon-13 present.
So let's talk about the isotope carbon-12 to 14 for a minute. Isotopes are formed of an element that have a certain number of neutrons, which are the subatomic particles found in the nucleus of an atom that have no charge. About 99% of all carbon on the Earth is carbon-12, which means each atom has 12 neutrons in its nucleus. Everything from the clothes we wear to the air we breathe to the plants and animals that we eat are formed from mostly carbon-12. Carbon-12 is a stable isotope, which means its amount in anything is the same all the time.
When Libby invented radiocarbon dating, he looked at carbon-14 because it was a much rarer isotope of carbon. It was unstable, and its atoms decayed into nitrogen over thousands of years. Radiocarbon dating uses the contrast between a stable and an unstable carbon isotope by measuring the ratio of carbon-14 that is left over in the organic artifact to the unchanged carbon-12. Because of accelerator mass spectrometry, radiocarbon dating can now be accurate to within a few decades.
So cool.
I know, very
so
cool.
cool. Unfortunately, there is a very real fear that the amount of carbon dioxide we pump into the atmosphere is going to very soon make it impossible to get accurate radiocarbon dating ranges. The reason is because fossil fuels are millions of years old, and they no longer contain any measurable carbon-14. What that means is that as we burn fossil fuels and release carbon dioxide into the air, it basically waters down the carbon-14 that should be there, and that will begin to skew radiocarbon dating. According to Peter Kolar, a physicist at the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research and lead author on a 2015 study about climate change and radiocarbon dating, by 2050, new samples of organic material will appear to have the same radiocarbon date as samples from 1,000 years ago.
Because of this fear, researchers like Kohler have been trying to come up with different ways to find the age of organic materials. One of the things Kohler started paying attention to was carbon-13, the other stable isotope. Carbon-13 is only in 1% of the Earth's atmosphere and is found in very low levels in fossil fuels produced from plants and the animals that eat them. Kohler figured out that if you are unsure of the accuracy of the carbon-14 reading, you can look at carbon-13 to distinguish if the radiocarbon is affected and wrong, or if it's not. A lower than expected level of carbon-13 would mean you couldn't trust the radiocarbon date. That's crazy.
It is, and I have to kind of say, doing archaeology, it's really easy to not even, think about fossil fuels and things like that, but contaminate a potential sample because we are organic beings. And when you're doing archaeology, many times you're, using your hands very close to whatever you're excavating out, whether you're using a trowel or a shovel or whatever. And if you don't do the sample just right, you've already contaminated
because
it.
all it takes is a younger organic material coming into contact with it to contaminate it.
Potentially, yeah. And it just kind of depends on how you're doing it or what you're doing it. So
how, as an archaeologist, do you prevent that kind of contamination?
Well, there's a couple different things you could do in terms of how you're excavating. So a lot of times you would do maybe you're excavating multiple different units, and one of those units is the one that's kind of considered the clean unit. That's the one you're going to get your samples from. And so when you're excavating it, you automatically use techniques to avoid some level of contamination.
What are those techniques?
There's different kinds. Some of them might be suiting the person up, wearing gloves, masks, all that kind of stuff. And then also not even excavating it purely, just chunking out huge samples or maybe not even huge samples, but large samples of what you're going to get to, and putting that directly in clean foil or a container of some kind so that you're not even touching it and there's no potential for organic material to come in contact with it. And then that way, when it gets to the lab, it was collected in a more sterile way and then stays kind of sterile.
I love it. It's pretty cool. It's really interesting that you've done it too. And if you guys want to see pictures of Karen doing that, we have some on our website.
Oh my gosh, do we still have those?
Yeah, I put them up there because I think they're cool. They're on Instagram too.
Oh my goodness. Well, that brings us to the end of our episode. You can follow the Unusual History of Everything podcast on Instagram at the Unusual History of Everything, and on Facebook at the Unusual History of Everything podcast, and find our show notes on www.musecuratorial.com. The Unusual History of Everything is written, produced, and directed by Melanie Dellis and Karen Lacey.
New episodes air every Tuesday on all podcast outlets. Be sure to subscribe to us so you never miss an episode and leave us a review. You can also see photos from our episodes and more on our website, Instagram, and Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Melanie Dellis.
And I'm Karen Lacey, your host for the unusual history of everything.
Da, da.